Hey guys, so tonight we're going to start talking about the French Revolution. We're going to do this in two parts. In this first part, we're going to talk about the causes or what's leading up to the French Revolution. And then the second part, and the major event, that'll be included in tonight's video as well. And then the second part is going to be focusing mainly on Napoleon and Napoleon's reign in France. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, the causes of the French Revolution. So the influence of the Enlightenment. So there are these new Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers, and they're coming up with these new ideas on government. They're advocating for different forms of government, questioning the normal forms of government, specifically, excuse me, monarchs and the rights of monarchs. And we talked about in class, questioning the divine right to rule, and questioning whether church and state should be separated. So all of these ideas are leading to revolutions and revolutionary sentiments and feelings in countries around the world. The American Revolution has already taken place, and it influences people in France. It makes them think in different ways about their government and question their government. So the Enlightenment really makes people start questioning their government in France in particular. Second, economic problems. So in France at this time, there's huge debt. The king had a lot of debt. He had inherited a lot of debt from previous kings. He was putting himself into more debt. Taxes were really, really high on the people to try to counterbalance the heavy debt that the king was facing. France had supported America economically in their struggle for independence from Britain, so that had put them in further debt. So there's a lot of debt. There's high taxes. That means the cost of living is really high. So it's like buying stuff and just living cost a lot of money. And then there are also shortages in bread and food. So there's bad weather, which caused poor crops, which caused a lack of food, and so food prices were really high, and it was really hard for people to eat. So all of these economic problems were causing turmoil in France at this time. And last, weak and indecisive leaders, specifically the two you see here, Louis XVI this time, Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. So don't confuse Louis XVI with Louis XIV, who we've already talked about. This is Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. They were pretty indecisive leaders. They didn't do a lot for their country. They inherited a lot of debt, but they put themselves in more debt because they still spent lavishly, even though they didn't have the money to spend. They didn't come up with economic reforms to fix the problems. So they were just pretty bad rulers, and they weren't very well liked, especially by the majority of the French people. So all of these lead to revolution and revolutionary ideas in France. So let's jump straight into some major events of the French Revolution. There are a ton of things we could talk about in this section of our video. I'm going to pull out 4. I'm hoping we'll watch a video in class on the French Revolution that will maybe give you an even better idea of all the things that are happening in France right now or during this time period. But let's look at the 4 we're going to talk about. So the first is the creation of the National Assembly, which took place in 1789. So in France, the way France worked, there were 3 social classes. Like when we talked about the world religions before and the social classes in Hinduism, France has 3 social classes. The first, they're called estates, E-S-T-A-T-E-S. And the first estate is made up of clergy, so members of the church. The second estate is made up of nobles, essentially, the really wealthy people and landowners of society. And the third estate is everyone else. The first and second estate together were 3% of the population, which meant the third estate was about 97% of the French population. So that is how the social structure in France was set up. And when France had all of this debt and the king was really struggling financially, he decided that he wanted to tax the second estate because previously only the third estate got taxed. You can't tax clergy or the church, and they didn't tax the nobility in France. So only the third estate was being taxed. And the king said, well, I'm going to start taxing the second estate so I can bring in more revenue, bring in more money. Well, obviously the second estate didn't like this, and so they called a meeting of the estates. This is how they would make decisions and agree on things, but reforms that the king wanted to do. So they bring everyone together. They're going to have this meeting. It's called the Estates General when they do this. So they have an Estates General. They bring all the estates together. And typically the first and second estate dominate the Estates General because every estate meets individually on policies, and then each estate gets one vote. So despite the fact that the third estate was way larger, 97% of the population, they had an equal vote with the second and third estates, kind of like our Senate today, how every state has the same amount of votes. So that's how it worked. So the first and second estate come into this saying, we're going to dominate the third estate like always. Well, there is this one guy who's sympathetic to the third estate, and he stands up. He says the third estate needs to break apart, and they need to come up with laws for the French people, since all of you represent the 97% of people in France. You need to stand up and you need to start making laws and assert your dominance over, and like your opinions over this Estates General. So what they wanted was just that everyone would meet together and every delegate would get a vote, not just one estate. So this would give the third estate more power. Well, the first and second estates and Louis said, no, that's not what's going to happen. And the third estate said, that's fine, we're going to meet on our own, and we're going to call ourselves the National Assembly, and we are going to start passing legislation. So they take matters into their own hands. They create the National Assembly, which is essentially delegates of the third estate, and they start passing laws. The tennis court oath is just when they do this, Louis says, all right, well, we'll just lock you out of the meeting. We won't let you into the meeting. So they lock their meeting hall. Well, the National Assembly just goes across the road. They find an empty indoor tennis court and they meet there instead. And they say, we're not going to leave this building until we come up with a constitution, and that is called the tennis court oath. So that's the first event, the creation of the National Assembly. Next, the storming of the Bastille. So the National Assembly was created in June, I believe June 17th of 1789. Just a month later, in July, you have the storming of the Bastille. So there was rumors that Louis was going to use military force to force the National Assembly, those delegates of the Third Estate, to disperse and stop meeting, and that he was going to bring in foreign armies to do this. And people were becoming hysteric because of it. They didn't want this to happen. They were really upset about it because, remember, the National Assembly represents 97% of the population. So everyone starts arming themselves. They go through the streets and they're getting arms and they're preparing to fight this foreign army that they think Louis is going to bring in. Louis doesn't actually bring in this foreign army, but they think he is going to. And so a mob, an angry mob in the street, breaks into the Bastille, which is a prison, and they break in and they want to steal arms and ammunition. And in the process of doing so, they end up killing all the guards at the Bastille. So they kill the guards, they chop them up, and they march through the streets with these guards' heads on spikes. This is an important act of revolution. And it also, July 14th becomes almost a day of like independence for the French people. It's marked and celebrated every year. It's kind of like our Independence Day somewhat, but it is an act of revolution. Oh, it's important to note that the creation of the National Assembly, go back in your notes, add this in. The creation of the National Assembly marks the first act of revolution against the monarchy. So National Assembly, first act, storming the Bastille comes just a month later, another act of revolution. All right. Third, the Constitution. So finally, 2 years later, after the National Assembly talks about it, they pass the Constitution. This Constitution limits the power of the monarchy and it makes France a limited constitutional monarchy. We talked about that with England under William and Mary becoming a constitutional monarchy. That's what this French Constitution does as well. And Louis actually signs it. He's reluctant, but he signs it. So in 1791, the National Assembly passes that Constitution they swore they were going to pass. Louis signs it reluctantly, and it limits the power of the monarchy in France. The last thing we're going to talk about today, it's not the last thing that happens, but the last thing we'll talk about today is the Reign of Terror. So after the passing of that Constitution, other countries in Europe are starting to get really worried about what's happening in France at the time. They don't want ideas and sentiments like this to spill over into their countries, and they're really worried about what's going on. So specifically, Prussia and Austria are pressuring Louis to put an end to this revolution that's happening in his country. And because they're encouraging this, the National Assembly gets really wary, and they declare war in 1792. So they declare war, and they're going to go to war against these countries for trying to stop the revolution that's happening in France and interfering in France. So all of this is going on, and Louis and Marie Antoinette are captured. The National Assembly, essentially, the majority of people in France are holding the king and queen, and they break their own constitution, and they go ahead and they try Louis, and they behead him. They kill Louis, and this marks a change. France becomes a republic at this point in time, so they kind of undo what they've just done and create something different in its place. And so France becomes a republic, and all of this is really encouraged and spurred on by a group of radicals called Jacobins. So it's spelled Jacobins, Jacobins. They're this radical group that's really encouraging all of this revolution. They're on the far side of everything, so they don't want just reform, they want total revolution and total change, and they're kind of leading the way for this. So in 1792, the Jacobins are kind of the ones in power, and eventually this one specific Jacobin, Maximilien Robespierre, becomes, I think he's on the slide, hold on, there we go. Maximilien Robespierre becomes the leader, or the he's in charge of France. So he takes power in 1793, and his reign is known as the Reign of Terror. He executes nearly 40,000 people during the time he's in power, and he's only in power for a year, and he executes about 40,000 people. And mainly, essentially, when you break it down, what their crime is not being radical enough. They are not invested in the revolution enough, and so Robespierre kills them because they're not dedicated to these revolutionary ideas. The ironic thing is that the majority, so I'm saying 40,000, that is a historical estimate. That's not a confirmed number, but that's a historical estimate for how many people he probably killed. The funny thing is that the majority of the people that he killed were part of the Third Estate, which were the people who supported and wanted this revolution to happen in the first place. But a year later, in 1794, some of the Jacobins are kind of nervous, and they don't really like how Robespierre's reign is going. They're worried for their own lives and their own safety, and so they kill him as well. So that ends the Reign of Terror under Robespierre. That is where we're going to end tonight. This kind of leads us up to the next step of talking about the French Revolution and when Napoleon comes into power. One last thing I forgot to mention is this picture on your screen is of a guillotine. So this is a symbol of the French Revolution, really. Really just Robespierre's Reign of Terror. The guillotine was a new invention used for beheading people. So you've probably seen it before, you've probably heard of it before, but it's where they put the person's head in that little stock at the bottom, the hole at the bottom, and they pull the string and it drops the blade to behead someone. It was supposed to be a more humane way of beheading people, if beheading people can be humane. So just a side note, that's the guillotine, kind of a symbol of the French Revolution. So thanks for watching, guys. Tomorrow we will talk about the second half of the French Revolution and Napoleon's reign. All right, thank you.